first part of this is, I suppose, particularly autobiographical. When I started college in 1984, Nicholas Pevsner would have been one of the kind of major architectural critics. And he said, a bicycle shed is a building, Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture. The term architecture only applies to buildings designed with a view to aesthetic appeal. So as a kind of 18-year-old, suddenly the buildings that I knew best, which were more like bicycle sheds than cathedrals, were removed from me as being kind of part of my life. Can we go to the next slide? So we all were in architecture school, and we all got our kind of black polo necks and glasses during the first semester, and we were all architects talking to one another and kind of involved in something that we felt was very important and to do with kind of aesthetically appealing buildings. Postmodernism was the thing at the time that made things aesthetically appealing, the drawings you see below. Go to the next one. And it was at a time that modernism was being questioned. Postmodernism was kind of the important kind of theory of the day, and within architecture then historicism and understanding the past became more important to everybody. So this is a copy of the Trulius, the 10 Books of Architecture, which were written in 1 AD, which I bought during my first year in college. You go to the next slide. Okay, so it's a little bit, anyway. I decided that it would be a worthy and most useful thing to bring the whole body of this great discipline to complete order. So that's Vitruvius talking in 1 AD, which is off the bottom of the slide there. And so it was all to do with order and ordering things, and classicism was quite an important kind of theory, I suppose. Go to the next one. So at the same time, this is 1984, obviously Sid Vicious was dead, that's Johnny Rotten. And culturally, like I wasn't, some punk with a Mohican, but culturally, I suppose, punk and DIY was my culture that I belonged to, that was different to my parents' culture, or different to kind of my teacher's culture in college. So there's these two sides then kind of happening simultaneously. Can you go to the next one? Next one. So the previous slide, which didn't show up the drawing of, was letter set figures of kind of what the ideal kind of client was, and the kind of letter set figures that at that stage you applied to your drawings. The kind of the people you were designing buildings for were ideal couples with children with balloons drinking cappuccinos in kind of corners of Italian squares. And this is a slide it's from the book Where Were You Then? And this is people of my own age around Dunleary at the same time. So the people I knew were very different to the people that we were kind of expected to design buildings for in college. You can go to the next one. So I left college, and I moved to Berlin in 1989, just before the wall came down. At the time, Berlin was just finishing up an international building exhibition where a lot of famous architects from around the world had designed buildings and there was a huge housing regeneration program. So I went there was a lot of work in that area. So during the day, I was working still within that kind of formal architecture scenario. And then at the same time, simultaneously in Berlin, the wall came down and there was a huge explosion of kind of, I suppose, informal activity. So this slide, you can see the Reichstag in the background. So it's right in the center of Berlin, and it's an urban farm where the squatted land where the wall had been, and a lot of people living there and farming. So if we go to the next slide. And that takes place in the wooded area on the right-hand side of that slide, and then further back, this was a sculpture by the Mutoid Waste Company, who were squatters from London, who'd come and were buying the leftovers from the Russian military at the time. You could buy anything, tanks and airplanes and things. So they were using those to make sculptures. And so that there's two things going on. There's a kind of the formal city ploughing on and doing what it does and redeveloping the new Berlin, and then a whole informal culture that, as it turned out in Berlin, was actually the thing that sustained Berlin and continues to sustain Berlin. Go to the next one. And this is Taculus, which was an art centre. You can see one of Mutoid Waste Company's make fighters there on the right-hand side. And all this was happening aside from the formal economy. And albeit Berlin, as a city, was extremely good at not questioning these activities, they were kind of throwing money at them through arts funding and through other kinds of funding. And probably a lot of that money got lost and spent by charlatans, but an awful lot of it just, there was no question of what an outcome would be. There was money given to, this squad to formalize itself, to kind of make sure the fire regulations, etc., were okay. But it was allowed to happen. And in fact, it only closed about 3 years ago because it had been sold to a foreign bank, I think, a little bit like a NAMAD situation here. You can go to the next one. And then this is more slides. Now, these are all slides by Dougal Sheridan from Lid Architects, who was in Berlin at the same time, because for some reason I didn't take any photographs for about 6 years. But all over the place there was, people making, stages and just informal activity everywhere you went. You can go to the next one. Markets, people living on boats. You can go to the next one. Containers, it's the first place I started to see containers being used like that. The next one. And this is an analysis of an apartment building on Brunnenstrasse that had been squatted. So on the left-hand side, it's how it was designed to be used. It's a 19th century apartment building where each of the apartments is used by a separate household. And on the right-hand side is a description of the use once it had been squatted, where people stopped living in single apartments and started living communally in kind of vague groupings like, gay and lesbian area up to the left. There was kind of some football supporters down to the right, artists living together. And so the front doors of the various different apartments were open. There was a sense of communality about it, but certainly a sense of common purpose amongst the people who were doing it. Go to the next one. And the next one. So, what there was within the area of central Berlin, there was about 200,000 people, it's reckoned, kind of living in this way. That's a quote from work that Dougal did, actually, from Lid Architects, which is lost at the bottom of the slide. So there was a huge community of people behaving like this. Okay, the next one. So, via Dublin for a few years, I arrived in Leitrim in 1999, and I still really wasn't sure what the relationship between my practice formally as an architect and all that other stuff that was going on that kind of excited me too. So, next slide. So, when I moved to Leitrim and I was working as an architect trying to get planning for houses around here, make it more vernacular was the kind of what I was hearing. You can go to the next one. And the kind of vernacular used in that way was always being used as a description of a style, like it was make it look more like an Irish cottage. And I suppose I started understanding it as more a way of doing things, a way of acting, which is more to the point of what the vernacular is about. So you can go to the next one. And vernacular architecture, most simply defined, is architecture of the people, designed and built by communities and families. And that's what started to be interesting to me. And it's also what started to be very much to do with the earlier slides, where that whole punk thing of the DIY culture, where you could make your own fanzine magazines, you could do a huge amount of things yourself, you could form a band, you didn't have to kind of know too much about music to start being in a band. So it was an enabling thing where you felt you could do things yourself. And the vernacular is exactly the same thing. It's people doing things for themselves. Okay, next one. That's now quite a long quote that's been lost. and it's talking about, that's a geographer called Zauer, who was a turn of the century geographer in America of German origin, and he was the first one who started to talk about cultural landscapes. And looking at the vernacular, the more you read kind of from architectural theory about the vernacular, it was all to do with what things looked like. And somehow geography was a more fertile place to look because they were talking about how things happen. So the whole notion of cultural landscape is one that connects people to the land, so that the landscape is like it is because of the workings of people on that land. So the person and the land are connected together. And go to the next one. And the result of that is chairs like this chair. This would be called a hedge chair or a vernacular chair. And it's made, the important things about it are that it's made by the people who are going to use it. The technology of how to make it is understood, therefore, by the user, so that if a leg breaks or a leg gets shorter because the bottom gets rotten, you just go to the hedgerow and you connect another bit to it. So it's not a consumer object, it's a chair for sitting on, which ultimately is a rearrangement of a hedgerow. So you go to a hedgerow and you find bits in that and you make it more useful for sitting on. And that's also political in that the large pieces of wood at the time were owned by the landlord and the hedgerows were kind of up for grabs. So that, I suppose, that object as a single object to me speaks a huge amount about the relationship between kind of design, society and consumer objects. That's just, it's made as a useful thing, but it is completely valid cultural production. And it's also not some, it's got obviously an ancient lineage of kind of evolution causing it to be like it is as opposed to design, but it is also a copy of a vague copy of Windsor chairs from the time that people would have seen in the big houses. So it's not even as if the vernacular is some pure ancient thing. It's got a constant ongoing relationship with formality. I suppose you can. So the slide you just missed there is a diagram of similarly how a vernacular house is a rearrangement of the site on which it sits. So when you're building a house, you're just taking a vernacular house, you're taking material from normally within very close proximity and turning that into a house. So if it's in the west of Ireland, you're collecting stones. If it's in the Midlands, you're collecting mud, you make mud walls. The thatching was normally done with rushes in this area. So you're just rearranging things, you're causing your agency to make, just like the chair made the hedgerow useful to sit on, you're making the land and the site useful to live in. So in that way, vernacular houses start being a part of the landscape, not because they look like the landscape or they're designed to fit in, they just are the landscape. And keep on going. And so just looking at what the implications of this are. So one thing really to do with the relationships that we kind of know in the world of architecture, where there's a client who wants something to be built and has money to do that, and he's thinking of a house. There's a builder who's building that house, whose motivation really is profit, and then there's the architect who is kind of has a very different idea, I suppose, of the house than the client does. So it's all, you know, capital, property, architecture, home, tax raising, investment, debt, contractual. The reasons kind of people started to build houses is very different to the vernacular tradition, where ultimately it does fit into the kind of economy, and the purpose of it is profit. So during the Celtic Tiger, for every €300,000 house, which was the average house price, 100,000 euros of that went straight to the government in the form of taxes and levies and etc., etc. So it's to do not anymore with the creation of houses for people, but to do with the creation of profit. Keep on going. So Eston Evans, writing in Irish Folkways, talking about, he says, the wide gap that separates the splendid mansions of the landed gentry from the humble dwellings of the mass of the rural population. So what had happened by the time I was being an architect was the rise of the middle classes had meant that many more people wanted architects. In the past, a small number of rich people had architects design their the big houses, and everybody else were behaving in a vernacular tradition. Keep on going. And so I was, I suppose, thinking about what kinds of houses I was making, and they were houses for everybody. They weren't houses for the landed gentry. They weren't houses for particularly wealthy people. And keep on going. You'll have to imagine another house there. And there's another one that's actually... Yes, yeah. Another missing house. Another one. And keep on going. So they were kind of the outcome of a difficult relationship between formal architecture and formal architecture practice, and a kind of I suppose a culture of production more akin to the vernacular. And exploring this the kind of relationship between DIY culture and rural culture was, you realized how you were living was very much to do with kind of houses, and you spent a lot of time in each other's houses, kind of looking at films, chatting, helping each other, sharing stuff like that, which probably for most people in the audience is, you can kind of recognize. You go to the next one. And coming out of that, and I suppose formalizing that a little bit, myself and some friends started HURL, the Home University of Roscommon and Leitrim, which was at the time I wasn't teaching. And so we decided to make our own university, which was to do with the kind of a cultural exchange. Keep on to the next one. And we started doing things at various different festivals that were to do with, if you go to the next one, events like this speed exchange, like a bit like speed dating, but you were swapping information on how to do things. Either, that could be cooking something or making something or doing something. So that you kind of went to these, and during the period of a day you learned a huge amount of different activities. And then Cannes Film Festival, run by my friends Willie and Natalia every year, which to me is one of the best cultural events in Leitrim, and it has to be said, contributes probably nothing to the economy, and isn't supported in any way by any arts offices or anything like that. And so much cultural production happens in sheds, and is aside from the economy, and the vernacular, the whole kind of essence of it is that nothing comes out of it. There's no money to the government, nothing. What comes out of it is, its intention is houses for people. And the intention of this festival is watching great films for a weekend. You can go to the next one. So that's where it happens. And then over the years, various different forms of let systems and kind of people swapping things, and which through the Celtic Tiger was obviously not as useful now, is once again a very important kind of thing for people to be able to, a resource for people to have. And you can see it a lot now on I suppose, particularly through Facebook, a whole kind of exchanging, buying, selling things that is of huge kind of cultural value. Go on to the next one. And then fitting into that model, my own house, which I built between 2009 and now, for 25,000 euros, kind of was able to be that cheap because of kind of living within a society of people who were willing to help one another, and through my understanding of the vernacular and kind of, I suppose, economic ways of building. So you can, next slide. And so that was kind of built with a lot of help from friends and neighbours. And keep on going. And keep on going. So, and it happened, like the house looking bit of it happened very quickly, and then there's obviously a huge amount of other work that goes on inside to make it habitable. And that's it finished. You can go on to the next slide there. So that then turns into a house, and without phenomenal debt to the bank. And what you do have is a social debt. So you owe everyone around you, both directly the people that helped you, and I'm not sure if we can go to the next. So, and so part of that social debt is then I made a website, irishvernacular.com, where you can download all the information on how to build it yourself. So in that way, it's talking about the vernacular tradition where the ability to make a chair or build a house isn't something that's owned by experts, it's something in the public realm. And that so an essence of commoning things. Go to the next slide. So some of this is gone, but you can go back to that one. So a number of just comments really. Architects cannot merely be interested in what buildings look like. The process of actions by all stakeholders that culminate in the completion of a new building affects strongly its likelihood of success as judged by its users or by a society at large. So that's me speaking as an architect, but you can kind of talk in that way to do with any cultural production. And then particularly to do with architecture, but also I suppose to do with other projects, at a time of increasing restriction, control and bureaucracy in architecture and building, it's important to assert the value of the informal. And that's really to do with people doing things because they need to do them and not getting too bound up with all the reasons why these days you can't do things. There's so much health and safety activity that completely destroys creating things, and that it's important for people to assert the value of creativity, of kind of messing, of doing things yourself that don't quite fit into the models of society, but through which, you know, new things are discovered. And I think that's the last. Oh yeah, that's just a prologue to that, a project I'm doing through the dock in Sweden at the moment, in this area that has 140 or 161 nationalities living in it, all in social housing. You go to the next slide, which isn't there. If you go back to that slide now. It's very much 1970s tower block, high-rise, low-density suburban housing, and kind of going there wondering what this place looks like that 161 nationalities look like, and it doesn't look like that, and it does look like the next slide that you can't see, which was the last slide. So thanks very much.